Hi, welcome to Comic Talk. I'm Joshua.
And I'm Drew.
And this week we're talking about Kill or Be Killed. Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips, Elizabeth Breeweiser.
Bang! So, we've read a lot of stuff from this team. What do you think right off the bat sets this apart from all of that?
The seemingly supernatural element.
Yeah. See, I haven't read Fatale. From what I gather, there's a good deal of that in that.
Oh, okay.
But same from Brubaker. Like I'm not used to that. You know, even back in like his comic book days and stuff. I mean, there's not a whole lot of supernatural stuff in like Catwoman, you know, or The Authority. Well, The Authority, I guess it was, but
Captain America. Yeah, everything he would do usually in superhero stuff was very. Like, it was the opposite.
It was very grounded.
Right, it was taking everything and grounding it and making it, her Gotham Central is another good example, right? Like, he would take these big, ridiculous things and try to pull them down and turn them into, like, street-level kind of stories, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was almost his style for a while, you know?
Right.
It was just taking the magic out of things.
Yeah, take the magic away. And, you know, in a way, though, even though there's supernatural elements going on, and it could be psychosis too, we'll get into more like plot concepts here in a bit, but this is very ground level. This is very much a street level book, right? It's a guy, you know, taking out a couple dudes, really.
Sure, it's not unanalogous to Criminal.
Right. Let's start with just from here. What did you think?
Oh, I loved it.
I loved it too. Yeah.
Yeah, I knew I was going to love it.
Yeah, I assume so. Let's talk a little bit about what this is then. Yeah. So, you know, let's give them an idea of what they're in for if they haven't read this yet.
Oh, by the way, Brubaker has like a little mailing list thing now, which I had seen a few pages out of this from, which is, I think, pretty much how I knew I was going to love it. But if you haven't signed up for that and you're a fan, you should do that because it's cool. Yeah. There's without giving too much away, there's a guy that has to kill people to keep himself alive. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and he's like a college kid.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And can I say this, for some reason it reminds me of Moon Knight a lot.
Yeah.
This almost feels like Ed Brubaker's rejected Moon Knight pitch. I mean, you know, not to be reductive of it, but, you know, mild spoilers. There's, you know, a spiritual thing that's making him go do stuff. He's very no-nonsense, but is he crazy kind of thing.
Right.
It starts out with kind of a hallway scene sort of thing that we've seen in Moon Knight a lot, where he's, you know, just bashing people and, you know.
I mean, there are obvious conceptual parallels. But as far as execution, there's not any Moon Knight that I've read that I would say is like this.
No, not really. But still,
it could be.
I do feel like if you're curious what this might be, think Ed Brubaker does Moon Knight. You know what I mean? And you've got a general concept of what you're getting into with this book here. So, can I ask you, what do you think? Do you think this supernatural stuff is actually supernatural stuff going on here?
As far as my theories on where this is going?
Yeah, what are your fan theories on what he's doing here? I'm just curious.
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, at this point, I think it's like a legitimate thing. You know, but I think that he wants me to think it's a legitimate thing at this point.
Right.
So.
Well, because I've always kind of wanted a Moon Knight story where you find out that he is actually just a crazy person.
Right, yeah, that'd be cool.
And I kind of feel like this is where that's going. I keep hoping, like, no, he's just a crazy person just killing people. And, you know what I mean? He's like the John Lennon guy that, you know, heard the dog told him to kill him. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And he's just his dad's old, you know, pictures or whatever, or telling him to kill people, and he's just a crazy person. I kind of feel like that's the vibe we're getting here. He jumped off of a roof and, you know what I mean? Like, fucked himself up, and now he's just a crazy person.
Yeah, and there is, definitely reason to believe that. There's definite plot device to be like, no, this whole time he was just out of his fucking mind and going around and killing people. So I guess, we're well into spoiler territory on this, so...
This is hard to talk about without spoilering. Spoiling? It's just spoiling, right? I like spoilering.
Spoilering.
Yeah. This is an Ed Brubaker book, so we talked about the plot a little bit, but let's move past that, because, the plot in his stuff is always cool, but I think it's a setup for a lot more usually in his work, you know what I mean?
So opinions on the protagonist? Like Dylan.
Like, do I like the protagonist?
Just general thoughts about him, I guess. Like, we mentioned there is kind of a setup for him to be a crazy person, but aside from that...
Well, I like the position that he's put in here. He's one of these kind of wishy-washy protagonists, that... It's hard to feel much for the guy, just because, at least for me, just because of kind of the way he's so unclear. And we get two such very different concepts of the character. We get the guy that we see at the very beginning who's telling us this story that seems very confident, right? And then we get this very different character from early on.
Yeah, admits that goes into backstory.
Right. Well, yeah, definitely. But
it's very clear. But
so what I mean, though, is that, like, you're really asking about two characters, you know what I mean? Because they feel like the narrator is the same character, but he feels so different to me than the character that's actually mostly in the story, which I think is interesting. It's a cool read, because you get, like, right off the bat, you see the character development that has occurred, and really what you're doing is you're getting told the story that fills in.
Sure, and that's what I was going to mention, is that it seems like a device to go back and make an otherwise possibly unrelatable character relatable, because the first issue, even the first few pages, starts off with a lot of, very bold statements, that people are going to absolutely agree with or disagree with. So, the ability to go back and kind of show him as just a regular nebulous ass person, serves that to that end.
Right, like prior to how he formed to who he is at the end. But when you're reading it, most of what you're getting, like, on the page as, like, the acting of the character, like the character as is on the page, is very wishy-washy character, but then, like, all the narration is this very like delineated, clear cut. I know exactly how I feel about things, which is cool, right?
Yeah, people like wishy-washy people.
Right.
Like, they find that relatable.
Right.
So there you go.
Yeah. But part of what happens here, because we're only in volume 1, though, is that those don't yet come together.
Sure.
Right? Like, there's still two very different people, which leaves a lot of room and makes me want to keep reading, right?
Sure. And, I wouldn't be surprised if volume 2 and 3 were the same thing. Logically progressing toward that end, but nonetheless. And then, his whole, like, social situation thing, I think probably also makes him relatable, because I think a lot of people have probably been in similar positions.
Right, sure. The sort of awkward love triangle kind of thing that a lot of people deal with, especially at that age and that time in your life, right? That's very common.
And it's set up sort of to where you're rooting for him. Like, it's obvious that you're going to favor him, like, in this whole situation. And then we get this very superhero classic kind of, it can never be, but at least, like, right now it's not going to work because you have to do this other thing that's...
Right. The use of some of the tropes are really clever in here. They sort of take these tropes that are often just very grand, sweeping tropes that aren't really explored, right? They're just used as a trope, right?
Sure.
I mean, the idea of a trope is that you can skip all that. That's normally the point. Like, you don't
have to explain it.
You don't need to describe it. You just go, okay, that's
People are like, oh, yeah, that's the thing.
That's he has too much to do, so that's not going to work. But instead of doing that, he takes the trope and he sort of deconstructs it. But I wouldn't call this, would you call this deconstructive work? I don't know if it's really deconstructive in that manner.
No.
Or at least that's not the thrust of it, right?
Right.
I don't feel like the point is to deconstruct a concept.
Yeah, and, the bit about leading the double life, is still very much the center point of all of the tropes and stuff like that, which, I mean, if it was deconstructive, past that point, I think we may see some sort of different starting point. But, I mean, it feels appropriate for, like, where he is, but it feels hilariously appropriate just because of, probably the background of the reader coming in.
Yeah. I feel this could easily be seen as deconstructive work, but to me the important difference between like what he's doing and what people like Morrison do or a lot of other deconstructive authors is, I think a lot of times to call something deconstructive, it needs to be the point. You know what I mean? Like the point of what you're doing is to deconstruct something that is normally just packaged and given to you, right? Like, you take the trope and you break it apart, but you're doing it to point out that it's normally not done, right? Like the point is to sort of hold it in front of the reader and give you a new perspective on it. But this doesn't do that. It does deconstruct a lot of like superhero and like origin story kind of things, but I never felt like the idea was that Brubaker wants to show you what these look like deconstructed. It's not so simple, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was getting, is it's not like he's pulling apart things for the sake of pulling things apart. Like it's almost like he's showing a love for those things and pulling them apart just enough to put this spin on them, but not really getting hung up on it and saying that I'm going to tell this type of story that's usually associated with this type of thing and deconstruct it from that standpoint.
Right. To me, it feels like the intention here is just character and world building, and not there's not some grand like let's break down comic books. So that's not what's happening here. It's not so up its own ass, I guess.
Right.
It's more of just let's tell a great noir story of a character that kind of goes down this street level daredevil-y Moon Knight kind of path, right?
For sure. So let's talk about some artwork in this.
Let's do, because it's definitely worth talking about, right?
So Phillips does some different stuff in this. What struck you as the same and what struck you as different?
Well, I mean, there's so many standard Phillips tricks in here.
Like what? People don't know.
Sure. Well, he does tend to focus in pretty heavily on very clearly delineated structure, right? He always seems to care a lot about ease of reading from panel to panel. Like you can tell that that's an important piece of the artwork for him, which a lot of guys don't. They figure like they'll figure it out, right? Like the main thing is to make sure.
Maybe the letterer will bring it together.
Right. Yeah, let the letterer bring it together with how the boxes, how you move between the balloons. But you can tell that he puts a lot of care specifically into how he lays out his panels. There's also a lot of like what I think of as signature Sean Phillips. One example being a full page, but 1/3 of the page is white with dialogue written down the side.
See, I haven't. That seems like a new device that he's using at least more heavily in this than in most prior projects. Probably
more heavily, I agree. But I've seen him do that specifically in almost everything I've seen him do. When he wants to give that kind of
pulled out
segue into a new thing kind of situation, he's using that here. What I see that's a lot different, though, is he's pulled away from the very structured layout of like grid layouts that he's used very heavily in the last few things he's done. He's moved away from that pretty heavily. It's still very clearly laid out, but he's moved more towards a more modern layout structure where it's not just, 3x3 and 6x3s and 9 and 12 panel. Like he's really broken free of that in here.
Yeah, and it seems like the third of the page thing probably is just something maybe that he was comfortable with and he feels like really fit the style of what he was doing with this. So, logically got more use.
Let's give an example of that third of a page, because even in black and white you can kind of see it. I mean, this is a standard Phillips device that he uses at least a few times in everything he's ever done.
Yeah. And the other thing that I really love about him is just his shading. Like what he doesn't show you in the images is priceless, man. It's the best,
right?
And it almost has like that strange pull against Brubaker style, because he has a tendency to like tell you like all the little detail things that nobody else would, and then here you have an artist that just kind of shades out most of like the important parts of the face,
right?
But then like everything else is really nice and good, and
right, yeah. And they also seem to work off of each other, where there is that line that Brubaker probably crosses sometimes, where he does a lot of telling, because he's a very noir writer, so he likes to add those little details in about what maybe, but instead of just telling like what there is, like he tends to go into like what the character has noticed, but then at the same time you're not getting that re-shown to you. Phillips will take that information and say, okay, that's already been told, right? So on the page you see something else, or a different angle or perspective that doesn't bother to include the bits that you've already been told about, which takes a pretty, I think, experienced artist and somebody with a pretty damn clear vision of what they're doing to be able to do that, to take what the writer has written and then not show that part. When you've got somebody so descriptive and verbose as
novel-esque,
Brubaker,
maybe.
Right? Yeah. So to get something so clearly told to you and then not just draw it on the page is, pretty high concept-y, really, from an artist perspective.
How many people could, take a popular novel and then make it into a graphic novel and like have it actually serve the story?
A story other than just be a picture book, right?
99.95% of the time, it just fucking adds pictures of what you're already being told.
You'd already know it. You don't really, wouldn't help anything. Now, at the same time, I think Breitweiser, Elizabeth, if we're talking about the shading and how things look, sometimes colorists not really that important, right? They just sort of color it as you would expect. But I think she plays a really important role in how this book looks and feels, right? The coloring is so, it's like very desaturated coloring, right? Like it doesn't stick out when you're looking at it.
And it's not really vibrant.
No, but it sets so much tone within the book. First of all, she's just not afraid to just really smash everything into like a couple colors, when necessary. She's not the kind of colorist who's looking to be the star.
Sure.
And I think it ends up really helping the overall narrative of it, just because it doesn't jump out at you. It like sits, you know what I mean? It just adds like some flavor to the stew,
Yeah, it's like the very overall like gray kind of, I mean, it's perfect again for the story.
And it's also, I think she's doing that thing, I could be wrong, but there's some artists who will take that old, I think it's like 256 colors that used to be printable back in the 80s. I think she's using that shtick.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I feel like this is that 256 style that gives it a little bit of an old school feel. because there's a lot of choice here where the color doesn't always...
Yeah, it's not what you would 100% ideally pick, but it works for some odd reason.
Right, because it's a very specific palette of like complementary and contrasting colors. There's none of these middle ground colors that help bleed everything together.
Sure.
So even though it's like very subdued in what she's doing,
there'd still be like a mint green.
Right, the color choices that she's using are sort of reduced, so there's some pop just from that, I think.
Definitely. The last thing about the art, what did you think? Well, I'm going to tell you what I think. The demon thing, I think, was odd. Because it's a very, I mean, this is a character to where they could have gotten into like that super grotesque detail, and they did seemingly the exact opposite. You know, it's just kind of like a shady, I mean, almost cartoonish. Like you have a hard time like taking it seriously at first.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure about that choice.
Yeah. I kind of had the same thought. I had sort of a reaction when I saw it. It really caught me off guard, but in that respect, I think it fulfills its purpose. To me, it did. Like on reflection or retrospection on it, I felt like the fact that it seemed so out of place from the rest of the story, artistically, also made it, to me as I'm reading, feel questionable, right? Yeah. Because the character himself, what is his name? Dylan. You know, he questions it throughout. Like, really?
Constantly, yeah.
You know, like, I don't know. And so it gave me the same reaction that he has, whereas if they would have made it fit better, I think I would have accepted it more.
See, my, what do you call it, rationalization behind it was a little bit different. It's that the demon is going to be more and more of, I think, like a central character, to this. So, pulling it like too far out and making it look like too drastically different from everything else would just be kind of a laborious thing after a while, and might detract from other things that you're trying to portray in the same scene as this guy, right? So having it really stripped down and just kind of shadowy makes it more usable visually, I guess.
Yeah. Easier, kind of simpler to insert. I mean, because it's already out of place, it gets to be out of place from then on, right? Like you've already, if you buy into it, then it's like, okay, it's all right that it looks sort of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right? Like you've already said, okay, that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, I'll buy it.
Well, I guess the last question then is, are you going to keep reading it?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been waiting for this to come out before the first issue came out, man.
Yeah.
This is my jam.
Yeah, it's
I
really
wasn't
cool.
Disappointed. That's the thing about it.
Yeah, I wasn't either. I think, didn't we both read this in one sitting, didn't we?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Straight through it. I will tell you, though, when I first read the first issue, I knew we were buying the trade, so I downloaded the first issue and just read it, just because I was curious. I wasn't completely sold on it.
Yeah?
Yeah, but I knew I was stuck with just the one issue, and it was going to be months before I could see what else I was going to get. Sure. So I didn't love it right off the bat, but as soon as I had the whole thing in my hand, I did. Like, as soon as I knew I could get to the end of the volume and read, like, the whole thing that he had set out as, like, here's kind of the first story, I was all in immediately.
Oh, yeah. Brubaker, Phillips, Breitweiser, Kill or Be Killed, Volume 1. It's awesome. Oh, who would you recommend it to?
Anybody into noir in general. That's always an obvious, Brubaker recommendation. I don't know. I have a hard time thinking of people that I would not recommend this to other than just children and
it's
such.
not appropriate for them.
Yeah.
By the way, so.
Yeah. Otherwise, just about anybody. I think this is also a good, like, starter comic for people that have just watched
the Avengers movies and shit.
Movies and, you know who this would be great for? Somebody who's watched, like, the Netflix Marvel shows.
Oh, and really likes them.
And it's like, yeah, those are really cool. I like how gritty they are and real. Yeah, perfect for those folks. You
Definitely.
Especially if they're like, oh, I don't normally buy into superheroes. You know, I mean, I know so many of those people, like, I'm not really into superheroes, but those Marvel shows are pretty cool.
Right.
This is, well, here's kind of, you know, where this can go if you really get into the craft and get into reading real comics, real comics,
quick. Yeah.
You know? So.
All right.
So there's that. As always, you can click right here. That has, you know, the thing for subscribing.
Yeah,
and then
we have other videos.
There's other video things here that you can check out from past episodes.
Cool.
Yeah. Thanks for
stopping by, y'all.